Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you here today. This is Douglas Nelson on the Life Points podcast. And today we're going to be discussing the power of three, the concept that in the universe and in our lives, macro level and micro level, that the essence of three has a certain degree of power and governance over how things operate, and we want to explore that a little bit. From a basic sense, let's just think about points in space or the concept of three different objects or items and what that enables. When you have one object, you're kind of defined, an object's defined at one point in space. When you have two, just geometrically, that enables two dimensions where you can have a line stretching from one to the other, but it doesn't necessarily define a three-dimensional space, more of just a plane on those two. When you have a third object at another location in space, that allows you to have that, mathematically, that X, Y, and Z axis in terms of directionality, which we know is three dimensions. And so three rounds out that ability to move within space. We've also learned from the standpoint of science and global positioning satellite systems, they are required to have triangulation to pinpoint exactly where something is. And in fact, they usually claim that 4 different satellites, for example, are needed to properly measure 3 points over time. So the 4th satellite tracks the other 3 in three-dimensional space to make sure there's no variance over time. But the core principle is having those 3 satellites that are able to triangulate down to one position. So these are some interesting notes around the concept of three, the power of three. Why do we emphasize that? Well, beyond people's likely familiarity with concepts in spirituality such as the Trinity and triune powers and that type of thing, we can also see easily in our everyday world what it means to kind of have a third perspective on something. It anchors things down. Legally there's a discussion around you need 2 or more witnesses to anchor something in reality more. And we can also look at a more basic sense that the first point in our power of three could represent a single point. The second concept could represent everything else. So you could say one and then not one, meaning all other possibilities. And some have suggested zero, the concept of 0 point and infinity. But there's other connections that can be made there. And then finally, 2, the number 2 points. So you have 0, 1, and 2. This is representing 3 points, but 1 is kind of representing that background, that system represented by the number 0. A single point in space represented by the number 1. And then the 2 can be framed in different ways, but in some ways to represent everything else in the system not being directly looked at. You could make that connection to the satellite and GPS analogy by saying that in addition to those 3 ways of looking at things, everything else is background. So what we're really talking about with the power of 3 is what mechanics, what physics are in operation within a system. And this can be a system of thought, this can be at the conceptual level, and I think we see this applied at a physical or mechanical level, all spheres of life. What's the power of this 3? So let's start with why are we discussing this and why is it helpful at a conceptual level? Well, when we think about energy, intelligent energy, which is what we're going to be working with within the program or the universe of Life Points, the Life Points program. So when we talk about intelligent energy, we want to start to understand the nature of the soul, the causal energies that are reflected by creation, by everything we see daily. We want to break down the different categories of what's going on. For example, let's look at just the human mind and soul, which is powered by these different aspects of intelligent energy. And you can start to think about categories of how we're not talking necessarily about thought directly, thoughts that we may have, the mental versus the emotional versus, the will. But we're kind of talking about the energy behind it that feeds and powers all three. Once again, here's an example of three. The three aspects of how we often think of ourselves making decisions. We have a mental component with the mind. We have a emotional component with the heart, and we also have a core will component around what we choose to do, decisioning, where we pull it all together and we move on something, often known as the will, or translating the whys of the heart into, a willed decision. So, kind of coming back to what this means in terms of energy, what we're trying to say is we want to see how the causal energy dynamics in our core being, how they operate. And this intelligent energy is pretty fascinating. And one of the things we'll be looking at is how it operates. And in the next section of this study, we will look specifically at what we refer to as awareness versus consciousness, and then a conscious awareness that is a mixture of both, and what that really means in terms of intelligent energy. And we'll break down intelligent energy more fully. To develop a framework, part of Life Points is related to navigation. So the idea that we're moving from waypoint to waypoint. Life Points base it on the concept of nautical navigation or celestial navigation with the use of the terms waypoints, which is you move from one reference point to another that gets you closer to your destination or your goal, your anticipated goals. And so as we work through those different waypoints, what framework helps us understand our model of navigation? So we're going to discuss the power of three in this first module around the conceptual aspect. So what do we mean by that? Well, we're going to start with three terms, and this is at the core of the Life Points program in general. We will see these three concepts move through and about, hopefully in a fairly helpful way, that can help each of us think about and orient to how we're making decisions, how we're moving through different challenges and aspects of our life. The first of these is the framework. The second is the focus. And the third is the flow state. There's different ways we could order these, but they all work simultaneously and through, I would argue, processes at both the micro and macro aspects of life. So let's talk about each of them. The flow state we'll start with. The flow state is the core energy. If you're talking about something that's liquid, solid, and a gas state of matter, then this would be that which flows the most freely. And sometimes it might be helpful to just put it in terms of energy and matter, or a liquid flowing versus a solid state. So this is the flowing state. This is the verb. If you think about grammar, the concept of what meaning we are conveying when we speak. This person is walking, or this person is doing this particular action. The action is the verb. That is what we're talking about with flow state. It's the energy, it's the core action, it's the animating power. And if you want to think in terms of the soul, the body, this is the core soul energy that's powering, giving you energy, decision energy that you have to be refreshed on after a good night's sleep, for example. This is your flow state. What is that flow state of awareness, conscious energy, again, which will be discussed in the next module more. What is that flow state? Then the second thing we want to mention is framework. Frameworks or models are the way we view the world, a set of parameters, a set of priorities or understandings around how the world works, around how we're interacting with the world. We each have a framework of different beliefs through which we're operating and living in the world. So we want to understand what our framework is and identify ways to optimize that framework. Thirdly, we have our focus. Focus is where our conscious attention is in this very moment. Attention, which we'll also discuss in more detail, can be more like a lamp or a flashlight. It can be honed in on a certain point, like a flashlight, or it can be more ambiently aware of what's happening in your attention field of awareness. And so we want to be specific on some of these terms so they convey a certain meaning, but some of them we may use interchangeably at times, or but we can get down to some of those core definitions enough to where it's useful, which is the goal. So our focus represents where our mind is at any given time, where our conscious awareness is at any given time. Our framework defines the priorities, the past history. In many ways, the past focus points, or where we've placed emphasis in our minds, so that we have this architecture or this infrastructure through which we're experiencing the present moment. Then the flow state is in some ways the purity of our focus. It's that energy that's coming in. So let's give an example. So if we have the experience of some frustrations or grievances or things we're frustrated with someone else or something that's happened, that may impact our flow state. In other words, the core flow of how we're experiencing the moment. So the energy that's coming in is mixed with these past judgments, these past opinions or beliefs, and that affects the purity of that flow state. And it's defining a framework that is, in some ways you could say, muddied, or there's a mixture. It's not quite pure because of those different beliefs and ideas. So the channeling of the maximum amount of flow state energy may be minimal. So the flow state is constrained, we could say. And if the flow state's constrained, our focus may be biased. It may be directed toward things that are not really our priorities. So you can start to see how these things are all interrelated. And to have a pure focus on something in life defines, or reflects where our framework, where our thoughts, where our flow state has been in the past. And so we want to just create this ever-changing picture through these concept of three things, three aspects. And we'll kind of wrap up this module by explaining what the power of these three things is, why there's not more, why there's not less. At a very minimum, what's happening when you interact with the world is there's some set of ideas that's flowing into you from an invisible part of you, that flow state. It's coming in, your thoughts that are emerging from a source. And then the next part of you is the prism or the focal point through which you're interacting with the world around you. So through your mind, or you could say through your body, you are giving life and expression and animation to that flow state, and you're focusing on a certain thing that you're doing in life. So if you're doing a daily task, your flow state, your energy, moving through a different kind of set of three with your will, your thoughts, and your emotions, you're now interfacing with the world through that focal point of mind and body. And you're doing so based on a series of frameworks, based on a series of beliefs, viewpoints, and priorities. And that's something we'll talk about more. We're going to build out each of these three concepts with some other triune concepts. So, for example, within the framework side, we're going to show how three different concepts feed the framework of your life: beliefs, viewpoints, and priorities. And we'll see how each of those is unique. With your focus, we're going to talk next about how the nature of awareness energy, conscious energy, and conscious aware energy all impact your flow state and focus. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this first Life Points module, and we look forward to discussing awareness and consciousness, the intelligent energy behind everything, and behind the power of three that we've just discussed today. Talk to everyone next time.